Hello, and welcome to the Perspectives in History podcast. I'm your host, Willem Kahn. Thank you very much for listening. This is part 15 of our series on the Marquis de Lafayette, entitled The Fallen Eagle. No major housekeeping announcements for this week, so without further ado, let's get on with the show. In the previous episode of our series on the Marquis de Lafayette, we picked up the narrative just after Lafayette and his fellow prisoners were released from the prison of Olmütz in September 1797, and we ended with the death of his wife Adrienne in December 1807. We did cover quite a bit in the last part, so I'll try to keep the recap as brief as possible. Upon being released from Austrian custody in September 1797, Lafayette, his wife Adrienne, and his daughters Anastasie and Virginie, along with a few other prisoners, found themselves in the city of Hamburg. The terms of the agreement between France and Austria stated that they were to set out for the United States within 2 weeks. However, their lack of money and Adrienne's poor health made this impossible, at least in the short term. Returning to France was also out of the question, as the French government still considered Lafayette a fugitive émigré, so the family relocated to a small manor in the Danish countryside for the time being. Before long, Adrienne recovered enough strength to travel to France, where she would work tirelessly to have her husband's name removed from the proscription list and to recover some of the family's property that had been seized by the government. In the meantime, Lafayette began looking into the feasibility of moving to America, only to be disappointed. He learned that relations between his native country of France and his adoptive one of the United States had deteriorated significantly in recent months, so much so that the two now appeared to be on the brink of all-out war. He wrote to a couple of his American friends, namely George Washington and Alexander Hamilton, both of whom told him the same thing. Given the current tensions with France, Lafayette's presence in the United States was likely to cause problems, both for himself and for the US government. This was disheartening to be sure, but Lafayette continued to indicate that moving to America might be his only choice, causing his friends across the Atlantic no small degree of consternation. It was not until the autumn of 1799 that these plans were laid to rest for good. On November 9th, General Napoleon Bonaparte, recently returned to France from the Middle East, overthrew the unpopular Directory and installed himself at the head of a new government dubbed the Consulate. At the urging of his wife, who was in Paris at the time, Lafayette took advantage of the temporary confusion wrought by the coup d'etat to slip back into France. Napoleon was none too pleased with this. It is true that he insisted on Lafayette's release while leading negotiations with Austria, but he had also made arrangements to keep him out of France afterwards, as he thought that the general might try to stymie his own political ambitions. Adrienne stepped in to broker an arrangement with the new first consul. Lafayette would agree to stay out of politics, and in exchange he would be permitted to retire unmolested to La Grange, a moderately sized estate located 30 miles southeast of Paris. His citizenship was to be restored to him at an indeterminate date in the future, provided he honored the terms of this agreement. Lafayette was more than happy to accept. He figured that his political career was done with anyway, and after the ordeal that he had gone through in the past several years, he was content to retire to a quieter and simpler life. Over the next few years, Lafayette went about improving La Grange, renovating the chateau, redesigning the grounds, and establishing a farming enterprise that met with more success than he initially expected. He made an effort to stay informed on current events throughout this time, although he was very much dissatisfied with the direction the country was going in. Napoleon was steadily consolidating even greater power into his own hands, seemingly undoing the progress made by the revolution that Lafayette had once helped lead. In this early stage of his rule, Napoleon tried to present himself as the true heir of the revolution, the one who would guide the process to its conclusion. To that end, he sought out the public support of the revolution's original leaders, Lafayette included. However, winning him over would be more difficult than the first consul had perhaps thought. As promised, he restored Lafayette's citizenship in March 1800. The two met in person for the first time at a party celebrating the signing of a new treaty between France and the US later that year, after which Napoleon offered Lafayette the position of France's ambassador to the United States. This was the first of several attempts by Napoleon to bring Lafayette into his government, and like all the rest, Lafayette politely but firmly declined, his excuse being that he intended for his retirement from politics to be both voluntary and permanent. This back and forth continued until May 1802. That month, a referendum was held to determine whether Napoleon should serve as first consul for life, He won by a fraudulent margin, with Lafayette being one of the 0.23% of voters to vote against the measure. He even went so far as to leave a message in the electoral registry, stating that he would not give his support to Napoleon until he made adequate guarantees that political and civil liberties would be respected. Furious at his insolence, Napoleon abruptly cut off all contact. By all accounts, Lafayette genuinely did intend to stay retired, and in this way he managed to avoid the worst of Napoleon's wrath. All that Napoleon was able to do against him was to constantly block promotions for his son, George Washington, and his son-in-law, Louis de Lasteyrie, causing them to end their military careers early. Napoleon had much larger concerns. He proclaimed himself Emperor of the French in 1804, and proceeded to lead his armies across Europe, winning a spectacular chain of victories against his enemies, and earning his reputation as one of the foremost strategic minds in history. By the end of the War of the Fourth Coalition in 1807, the French Empire stretched across the continent, from Spain in the west to Poland in the east. For Lafayette, sequestered away at Lagrange, these years were largely uneventful. Toward the end of 1807, tragedy befell the family when Adrienne, the Marquise de Lafayette, died at the age of 48. She and Lafayette had been married for 34 years, practically their entire adult lives. Throughout that time, she had stayed by his side, a constant source of emotional strength. Taking into consideration that this was a time when so many of his oldest friends were dying, Washington, Hamilton, Noailles, it would take a long time for Lafayette to move on from this most devastating of all losses. In one letter dated April 8, 1808, he tried to give voice to his sorrow in the following way, quote, "In her, at every moment of a union of 34 years, I have found the greatest blessing my heart could wish for, and more than a compensation for every public misfortune. Before this blow, I confess, I did not know what it was to be unhappy. Now I feel myself irresistibly overpowered." End quote. The recipient of this particular letter was one of Lafayette's surviving friends, and someone who had also dealt with the untimely death of a spouse, Thomas Jefferson. The two would begin to correspond more frequently at this time. Of course, all of their letters were not quite as melancholy as the one I just read from a moment ago. Lafayette's tone would lighten as he gradually climbed up from the depths of despair. For instance, in an undated letter to Jefferson, Lafayette boasted about the surprising degree of success he'd met with in his farming pursuits. Quote, "I've become a pretty good agriculturalist, and lame though as I am, I muster my strength where walking is concerned, and I manage to do and to oversee what is essential." End quote. Lafayette tried very hard to keep himself preoccupied during this time. His typical daily routine, as he mentioned in the passage I just read, involved making the rounds on his property, going from the sheep pens to the dairy barn, and then to the orchards and so on, all with the assistance of a cane ever since he broke his femur in 1803. When that business was done, he would retreat to his library, where he spent long hours working on his memoirs, reading books on subjects ranging from agricultural science to political philosophy, and of course, keeping up correspondence with friends and sympathizers across the world. Lafayette's evenings were often spent entertaining the steady stream of guests who called on him at Lagrange, holding court like he used to at his residence on the Rue de Bourbon all those years ago. People of all types sought him out, with old acquaintances, comrades who he'd served alongside in the military or the Constituent Assembly. He reminisced about better times. To the occasional young officer he gave his counsel, and to anyone who would listen, he spoke endlessly about liberty, the importance of constitutional government, and the sorry state of affairs in France. Lafayette, of course, continued to follow the news, and despite the ever-present threat of arrest, he was never afraid to speak his mind. When one of Napoleon's generals with whom he was on speaking terms obliquely expressed astonishment that his opposition to the emperor had not landed him in prison, Lafayette responded, quote, "Living retired with my family on a farm, I have not given my enemy much cause for antagonism, although I nonetheless have always been open about my opinion of the famous emperor's system and my deep desire to see its end." End quote. From the heights of power Napoleon reached circa 1807-1808, he would begin a steady and inexorable fall. The beginning of the end, by most accounts, was the outbreak of the Peninsular War. After the conclusion of the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807, Great Britain was the only remaining European power at war with France. Having deemed a direct invasion of Britain too costly, Napoleon intended to force their surrender by means of a total trade embargo against them, the Continental System as it was called. The Kingdom of Portugal refused Napoleon's demands to enter into the continental system, prompting him to order an invasion and occupation of the country. This, coupled with his decision to force the abdication of the King of Spain, and his subsequent installation of his own brother, Joseph, as king, provoked armed resistance to French rule throughout the Iberian Peninsula, hence the name Peninsular War. Great Britain intervened on behalf of the Spanish and Portuguese, committing a significant number of ground troops to the peninsula. This ensured that the French were never able to fully pacify the region, and it tied up resources that would be sorely needed elsewhere in the empire later on. Then, in late 1810, Emperor Alexander I of Russia, who essentially agreed to an alliance with France 3 years prior, suddenly broke with Napoleon and, crucially, stopped participating in the trade embargo against Britain. This led to Napoleon's fateful decision to declare war on Russia on June 22, 1812. Lafayette, writing to Jefferson 2 weeks later, offered his analysis of the strategic situation in the East. Quote, "At this moment, immense continental forces are attacking the Russian Empire. Will Tsar Alexander fight? Will he negotiate? He runs a risk in either case of defeat or ensnarement, but if he stretches out the war for a long time, by retreating strategically and extending the French line of supply, he may well embarrass his opponent." End quote. Lafayette's comments turned out to be quite prescient because, as anyone who knows the first thing about the French invasion of Russia could tell you, that is more or less exactly what happened. As the French advanced, the Russians avoided a direct confrontation as long as they could, instead steadily withdrawing eastward, laying waste to the countryside as they did so. The French reached the Russian capital of Moscow on September 14th, only to discover that the city had been almost completely evacuated and then intentionally set ablaze. In October, as winter began to set in, Napoleon ordered a full retreat, an agonizingly slow process, during which time the army suffered from hunger, exposure to the elements, illness, and frequent attacks by Russian partisans. By the time the remnants of Napoleon's army finally evacuated Russian territory, less than 70,000 of the once 500,000 strong force survived, only a small fraction of which were combat ready. In the wake of the unmitigated disaster that was the invasion of Russia, Prussia, which had been effectively relegated to the status of a client state, turned against France. They were joined shortly thereafter by Austria and several of the smaller German states. Napoleon scrambled to rebuild his army but was pushed out of Germany entirely as a result of the Battle of Leipzig in October 1813. Coalition forces steadily continued advancing on all fronts, entering the territory of France proper by the new year of 1814. Napoleon, in response, launched a counter-offensive in the hopes of fending off the coalition's invasion. Lafayette felt conflicted about all of this. On one hand, he was excited to see that Napoleon's rule was about to come to an end, but on the other hand, quote, "Seeing the storm that Napoleon brought down over France, I felt tormented by my inability to combat domestic tyranny and foreign invasion." End quote. Lafayette actually found himself in Paris as coalition forces closed in on the city in the early months of 1814. His aunt-in-law, the Madame de Tesse, and her husband fell seriously ill in December of the previous year, and both had died within a week of each other. Lafayette went to Paris to look after their affairs. They bequeathed to him their residence at 8 Rue d'Anjou in Paris, which today stands just down the street from the U.S. Embassy. Compelled by a mixture of anxiety and curiosity, Lafayette remained in the capital for several weeks afterward to bear witness to the events to come, perhaps even to participate in them. That past November, Napoleon issued a decree to remobilize the National Guard, which had been all but inert since he took power. One of several actions he took that indicated his intention to fight on to the bitter end. It would be to no avail. Many of his soldiers, perhaps the majority of them, were willing to follow the emperor in a battle to the death, but the general populace was not. Napoleon had always predicated his legitimacy on his military prowess, and the chains of defeat that he had endured, beginning with the failure of the Russia campaign, had very much eroded that legitimacy. More than anything else, really, the French people wanted peace. One mustn't lose sight of the fact that France had been at war for 22 continuous years. Lafayette summarized the prevailing mood in the following way. Quote, "In 1814, France was tired of Bonaparte's ambition, his despotism, and his interminable wars. He has employed all the resources of his genius to kill the public spirit. On the day of danger, he finds himself standing alone." End quote. In the end, it would not be a popular uprising, but defections from within his government and military that would force him to concede defeat. Despite winning a series of battles against the coalition forces in mid-February, Napoleon was unable to fully halt their advance. Paris fell on March 31st. As Tsar Alexander led Allied troops in a triumphal procession through the capital, Napoleon withdrew to the suburb of Fontainebleau to plan his next move. There he was confronted by his marshals, his most trusted subordinates. They refused to keep fighting for a lost cause and advised Napoleon to finally admit defeat. He complied, abdicating the throne on April 11th, 1814. The victorious allies elected to banish the former emperor to the small Mediterranean island of Elba, just off the west coast of the Italian peninsula, a decision that they would come to deeply regret. With Napoleon making his exit from the stage, or so it seemed, the question on everyone's mind was, naturally, what will come after him? Lafayette had long felt uneasy about the prospect of a resurgence of Jacobinism or royal absolutism in the event of Napoleon's fall, as he indicated in his correspondence with Thomas Jefferson all the way back in 1804. Now, 10 years later, all of Europe was contemplating these same questions. Opinion was divided on who would lead the nation in the post-Napoleonic era, even among the Allies. One political operator who had given this question much thought was the ever-present Talleyrand. Using diplomatic back channels, he had orchestrated the relatively peaceful handover of Paris to the Allies and the restoration of the House of Bourbon as the ruling dynasty of France. The new king, Louis XVIII, is actually a character we've introduced already, although I referred to him by his former title, the Comte de Provence. As you'll recall, the Comte de Provence was the elder of Louis XVI's two younger brothers. Something I believe I failed to mention at the time is that in June 1791, Provence attempted to flee France at the same time as the flight to Varennes, only he managed to successfully make it out. After Louis XVI was executed in 1793, Provence declared himself King Louis XVIII. A brief aside, the reason why he was known as the 18th of his name and not the 17th is because the throne technically passed to Louis XVI's 8-year-old son upon his death, making him Louis XVII. He remained imprisoned by the French government and died of neglect 2 years later, having never ruled in his own right. Anyway, the other émigrés accepted Provence's claim to the throne. He spent the next several years moving between various locales in Europe before settling in Buckinghamshire in southern England. Unlike his younger brother, the Comte d'Artois, Louis XVIII was not interested in prosecuting the émigrés' war against the French Republic. Instead, he led a life of indolence and gluttony, gaining a massive amount of weight as a result. He also developed a bad case of gout, which restricted his mobility. Practically all the sources I consulted for this episode mention his appearance, a lot of them in a strangely mean-spirited way. Phrases like horrifyingly fat and as fat and wheezy as a bloated old dog are just a couple of examples. Authors Fuye and Babeau make a more subtle jab, writing that when he arrived in Paris over a month after the Allies captured it, 6 horses were needed to pull his carriage. Historians do tend to give the new king some credit for being more pragmatic than his late brother. He recognized, or perhaps was compelled to recognize, the reality of France's political situation. A lot of time had passed since 1789, after all, and in the intervening years, the French people had grown accustomed to certain civil and political rights, and they would no doubt resist attempts to wrest these rights away from them. In other words, it was not possible to return France to the way it was during the Ancien Regime, before the Revolution. If the restored Bourbon monarchy had any hope of survival, concessions would have to be made. Hoping to mollify the populace, Louis XVIII, prior to his entry to Paris, issued a declaration stating his intention to draft and promulgate a new constitution. If we are to take Lafayette's word for it, when Louis XVIII processed into Paris on May 3, 1814, the public received the king with general goodwill. The citizens of the capital did stage a demonstration in support of the king, but it seems more likely to me that these celebrations were motivated more by the return of peace than any affinity for the House of Bourbon. In his memoirs, Lafayette summarized his own feelings at the time in the following way, quote, "I should have scrupled to recall the Bourbons myself. Nevertheless, such is the strength of early impressions that it was with pleasure that I witnessed their return. The sight of the Comte d'Artois in the street moved me greatly. And, forgiving all the wrongs that they had done, not only to myself but to our nation, I wished with all my heart that liberty might associate itself with the reign of Louis XVI's brother." End quote. Considering the enmity that had existed between Lafayette and the two princes in the past, this was quite a remarkable statement for him to make. The last time Lafayette had seen them was in 1794, when he was being transported between prisons by the Prussian authorities. If you'll recall from our discussion of this brief encounter in episode 12, the scene was so tense that Lafayette could not bring himself to say anything to the princes, nor they to him. Now, in April 1814, after seeing the Comte d'Artois return to Paris ahead of the king, Lafayette sent him an unusually sycophantic message as soon as he was able. Addressing him as "my lord," he wrote, quote, "There is no sentiment of my life that does not contribute to make me happy to see your return become the signal of public liberty and happiness. Profoundly joining you in this moment of national satisfaction, I feel the need to offer you the homage of my personal attachment and respect." End quote. Lafayette's deferential attitude toward the Bourbon Restoration merits some examination. Was he merely caught up in the excitement of the moment? Were his latent monarchist sympathies resurfacing? A letter that he wrote to a friend of his in the civil service in April is revealing. Referencing the Constitution of 1791 that he was heavily involved in drafting, he stated, quote, "It showed that the best and only means of salvation was returning to the first principles of the Revolution. We have been assured the king and his family have decided to go in the same direction, and in general, their conduct and their speeches have been in keeping with this assertion. The arrival of the king will decide the formation of a new constitutional order." End quote. These hopes that his dream of a true constitutional monarchy might, after all these years, be realized are entirely understandable. Sometime either in late May or early June, King Louis XVIII held his first public reception at the Tuileries Palace. Lafayette was invited to attend. Although he later noted that both Louis and Artois treated him with courtesy, this would be the only event of this kind that he would attend during the reign of Louis XVIII, for reasons that will become clear shortly enough. This particular event is noteworthy for another reason, as it was here that Lafayette first met one Louis Philippe, the Duc d'Orléans. Since he's going to be a pivotal figure later on in our narrative, I think it's proper that we set aside some time to introduce him now. Born in 1773, thereby making him 40 years old at the time of the Restoration, Louis Philippe inherited the title of Duke of Orléans after the execution of his father and namesake in 1793. Louis Philippe managed to successfully escape France in time to avoid being a victim of the Reign of Terror, like the former Duc d'Orléans, or Philippe Égalité as he preferred to be called in the final years of his life. Initially, the young Louis Philippe stayed at various locales throughout Europe before spending 2 years between 1796 and 1798 in the United States. During a visit to Mount Vernon, he met and befriended another exiled Frenchman, Georges Washington Lafayette. This was somewhat ironic, seeing as how their fathers had not gotten along, to put it mildly, but with one beheaded and the other languishing in an Austrian dungeon, these differences no longer seemed to matter quite as much. Louis Philippe returned to Europe in 1800, initially settling in England. He subsequently entered the service of the British government in 1808, acting as a British agent in southern Italy until he returned to France at the time of the Restoration 6 years later. During his stay in England, he effected a reconciliation between the senior branch of the House of Bourbon and the cadet Orléans branch to which he belonged, hence why he was welcomed at the court of Louis XVIII, despite the fact that his own father had voted in favor of the death penalty for Louis XVI. Evidently, the Duke of Orléans had a talent for winning other people's confidence. Lafayette found himself rather taken in by his charm. Quote, "The manner in which the Duc d'Orléans asked for news of my son, with whom he had become acquainted in the United States, made it my duty to speak with him. He spoke of our times of proscription, of the similarity of our opinions, of his consideration of me, for my principles and for my character. This was in terms superior to the prejudices of his family." End quote. He would later go on to write that he considered Orléans to be, quote, "the only Bourbon compatible with a free constitution." End quote. Of course, he said this with the benefit of retrospect. For the moment, Lafayette was not quite yet disillusioned with the restored Bourbon monarchy. Later that month, that is to say May 1814, Lafayette met the Emperor of Russia, Alexander I, at the salon of their mutual friend, the Madame de Staël. 20 years Lafayette's junior, the Tsar thought of himself as an enlightened absolutist like his grandmother, Catherine the Great, or at least that was the image he sought to cultivate. As I mentioned earlier, Alexander had led the procession of Allied troops into Paris just prior to Napoleon's abdication. In fact, that the city was spared from wholesale destruction at the hands of the Allied forces was thanks largely to Alexander. The proclamation he issued to the citizens of Paris contrasts starkly with the fire and fury rhetoric that characterized previous communiques directed at them by foreign leaders, like the Brunswick Manifesto of 1792. Alexander's declaration read in part, quote, "I am a friend of the French people. It is wise and just to endow France with strong liberal institutions that are in keeping with the current times. Our allies and I only come to protect your freedom." End quote. Lafayette spoke with the Tsar at length. Over the course of their conversation, he was pleased to find that Alexander was, in his estimation, quote, "a great, sensible, and noble-minded man, and above all, a sincere friend of liberty." End quote. They expressed to each other their hopes for the pan-European diplomatic conference that was to be held in Vienna later that year, that it might create a new international system based on mutual respect for constitutional order. Where they disagreed slightly was on the matter of the Bourbons. Alexander, unlike Lafayette, was skeptical of their commitment to the liberal principles that they both shared. When Lafayette commented that the Bourbons appeared to have, in his words, quote, "corrected themselves," end quote, Alexander retorted, quote, "Corrected? They have not corrected their ideas, and they remain as incorrigible as ever. There's only one of them, the Duke of Orleans, who has liberal ideas. As for the rest, you should expect nothing from them." End quote. Naturally, Lafayette then asked Alexander why he had brought them back, to which he replied, quote, "It isn't my fault. I wanted to delay them so that this nation would have time to impose a constitution on them. They overcame me like a flood." End quote. Alexander's distrust of the Bourbons would prove to be justified, and Lafayette would come to see things from his point of view in due time. For Lafayette, the first sign of trouble came in early June, when Louis XVIII, at the insistence of the Allied powers, issued a new constitution, the so-called Charter of 1814. The new regime's regressive outlook was evident from the very opening of the document, which stated that it was issued in the 19th year of Louis XVIII's reign, pretending as though the events of the past 2 decades might as well have not even transpired. Lafayette was pleased to see that many civil rights, the freedom of religion, freedom of speech and of the press, and so on, were guaranteed, and that a bicameral legislature was to be established. That said, the arrangement laid out in the charter was far from ideal for liberals like Lafayette. The upper chamber of the legislature, the Chamber of Peers, was to be appointed directly by the king. The lower chamber, the Chamber of Deputies, were to be elected, but the charter restricted suffrage on the basis of gender, age, and economic status. Moreover, neither chamber had the enumerated power to create legislation. They were permitted only to approve or reject laws proposed by the king, who also retained the power to dissolve the legislature at any time and for any reason. What concerned Lafayette the most was the philosophy that seemed to underlie the charter. The wording of the document framed it as something granted by the king to his people, rather than a set of fundamental laws decided by the popular will. As such, there was nothing within the charter stating that the king was legally bound to observe its terms, or that he could not alter them at will. Lafayette understood this to be a rejection of the very notion of popular sovereignty, the basis on which the liberal theory of government was premised. Writing to Jefferson in August, Lafayette denounced the, quote, "illegality of a charter where the sovereignty of the people is flatly denied." End quote. As concerning as this was, though, Lafayette still held on to a belief that the Bourbons, flawed as they may be, were preferable to the alternatives. In that same letter to Jefferson, he expressed his hopes that the French people could compel the monarchy to respect their hard-won rights without having to resort to the extremism that characterized the later stages of the Revolution. Quote, "If the resistance of the Bourbons and their party necessitated a new July 14th, a new Bastille, it can still be done under the auspices of civil authority and by the best-intentioned men of the Revolution." End quote. And so Lafayette returned to Lagrange in the summer of 1814, still hopeful that things would work out for the best. And now a word from our sponsor. And now, back to the show. Over the course of the next several months, the French nation would become seriously disillusioned with the restored Bourbon monarchy. The fall of Napoleon's empire had given rise to numerous social and economic issues that the king failed to adequately address. To begin with, the demobilization of the Grand Army left thousands of former soldiers, already bitter at Napoleon's defeat, without employment. Under the restrictive voting laws included in the Charter of 1814, they could not give voice to their concerns in a democratic manner. Making matters worse were the thousands of royalist émigrés who returned to the country at that time. Supported by an ultra-royalist faction at court led by the Comte d'Artois, they were bent on seeking reprisal for the crimes committed against them during the Revolution. After years outside of the country, these returning émigrés behaved in an insolent manner. They cast the tricolor flag to the ground and trampled it underfoot. In its place, they flew the solid white banner of the Ancien Regime. They treated other Frenchmen with contempt, as though they were a separate, lesser race. Lafayette himself was one of the targets of their scorn, as they still held a grudge against him for his role in instigating the revolution. The top priority for these returning émigrés was reclaiming the property that had been confiscated from them. The issue was that their landholdings, especially the larger ones, had long since been broken up into smaller plots and auctioned off by successive revolutionary governments. The peasants and bourgeois who now owned these lands were not keen at all to surrender them to their former owners. These disputes put the king in a difficult position. The aggrieved nobles pleaded with him to use his authority to simply order the reconfiscation of their property, and while he was inclined to sympathize with them, he also recognized that such an action would almost certainly provoke a popular rebellion, one which the restored monarchy, in this critical early period of its existence, was unlikely to withstand. These things that I've just laid out, the social and economic disruptions that accompanied this change of regimes, these were bad enough. But in Lafayette's assessment, the most grave problem facing the restored monarchy was the humiliation that the French nation had endured. Even for all his criticism of Bonaparte, he could not deny that under his leadership, France had reached incredible new heights of glory and prosperity through their mastery over Europe. He explains, quote, "The French people accomplished the overthrow of thrones, 300,000 Republicans rising against the coalition of Europe and dispersing it in every direction. The sovereigns trembling before the little corporal of the army of Italy, who became emperor of the great nation. Incredible victories no longer surprising anyone, the French decrees signed in all Europe's capitals, prodigious constructions paid for with the tribute of vanquished or protected nations, masterpieces from all centuries, from all countries meeting in the museums of Paris, and at the same time, since the Gordian knot of privileges had been cut, an immense opening to talents, to ambition, to the speculation of the entire population, agriculture, industry, the sciences, the arts, intellectual research, the effective well-being, and the political ideas of 5/6 of the nation, increase in 25 years in a proportion which one would not find an example of at any other time in history." End quote. And after having achieved all of this, Lafayette continued, quote, "Suddenly the nation shrank to the level of humiliating circumstances and the contemptible prejudices of the counter-revolution. It was too much to endure all at once." End quote. Under these conditions, it is understandable that a great many in France clamored for the emperor's return. In the national consciousness, Napoleon was a figure associated with glory, with honor and victory. Bourbons, by contrast, with reaction, ignominy, and defeat. As Lafayette summarized the state of the nation going into 1815, quote, "It took only 10 months for the government of the Bourbons to restore popularity to this man whom France had hated for so many years." End quote. From his exile on Elba, the former emperor observed the situation in France closely. Sensing an opportunity, he escaped the confines of the island and landed on the southern coast of France, near Caen, on March 1st, 1815. Accompanied by a small retinue of followers, Napoleon began marching north. There was little doubt as to what his destination was. The government dispatched regiment after regiment to halt his advance, only to discover that Napoleon still commanded the allegiance of the army, officers and enlisted men alike. Each detachment sent to arrest the emperor defected and joined him on his march to Paris. Before long, his advance became unstoppable, as the government could not rally enough loyal units to oppose him. For Lafayette, news of this crisis spurred the old general into action. In his memoirs, he wrote that, although he had his misgivings about the current regime, he felt the need to, quote, "be at the center of the situation, and if it was possible, to take advantage of it for the good cause." End quote. Lafayette raced to Paris ahead of Napoleon and his troops. He quickly made contact with like-minded liberals, and for a few days they frantically deliberated how they might block Napoleon from reassuming power. All manner of proposals were made, but none came to fruition. The garrison stationed in Paris defected to Bonaparte on March 19th. Louis XVIII fled the city that same night, bound for the city of Ghent in the Netherlands. He carried with him 60 wagons laden with all the gold and silver that he was able to pilfer from the National Reserve. The king was one of the last to leave, in fact. Many of the most fervent royalists had made their escape days earlier, including the Comte d'Artois. Napoleon entered the city the next day and promptly seized control of the government. Witnessing the enthusiasm which accompanied the emperor's return, Lafayette remarked, quote, "He again became the army's man, even the revolution's man, to the great misfortune of France." End quote. In truth, Napoleon's situation was highly precarious from the beginning, on a domestic and international level. The nations of the coalition that had defeated him a year prior declared him an outlaw, proclaiming that he was, quote, "enemy and disturber of world peace." End quote. They refused to recognize his return to power as legitimate, and instead mobilized their forces for war once again. If Napoleon had any chance of remaining in power, he would have to defeat the Allies on the battlefield and force them to the negotiating table. This could only be accomplished if the entire French nation was united behind him. In Lafayette's estimation, Napoleon's only hope was to, quote, "make himself a constitutionalist. His mind and his character are like opposing currents. He is a strange mixture of imperialist, terrorist, and liberal, but public opinion is stronger than him, and he has a prodigious talent for submitting to anything that he cannot dominate." End quote. Surely enough, Napoleon, prior to entering Paris, declared his intention to, quote, "create a new constitution based on liberty and in conformity with the people's will." End quote. Quite a few people were taken in by Napoleon's profession of a new, more liberal doctrine. Some 200,000 attended a mass rally he staged at the Champ de Mars in May, where he espoused similarly liberal rhetoric. Lafayette was not in the audience that day. He remained skeptical of the emperor's intentions and cautioned others to do the same. In particular, he was worried about his friend and fellow liberal Benjamin Constant, a prolific author of political theory. Constant had initially supported Napoleon in the early stages of his rise to power, but decided to distance himself from him after he was declared consul for life in 1802. He went into exile in Britain, moving back to France after Napoleon was ousted from power in 1814, whereupon he struck up a friendship with Lafayette, whom he had been acquainted with for years but was previously not very close. He found himself living in Paris at the moment the emperor made his return. Writing to him in early April, Lafayette warned Constant to not accept Napoleon's supposed change of heart so willingly. Quote, "One can only be the active leader of a free people in a republic, where, either as president or as dictator, one is subject to popular criticism and legal responsibility. There can be no freedom in a country unless there are freely elected representatives, empowered to raise and dispose funds, to create laws, organize military forces, to deliberate in debates published by the newspapers under complete freedom of the press, and supported by all that guarantees individual freedom. I want to be assured that the emperor can resign himself to such institutions, but so far I don't believe that he can." End quote. Constant, perhaps hoping to push Napoleon to act on his liberal rhetoric, chose to lend his support to the emperor. At his behest, Constant drafted a document intended to serve as a new constitution. Although it was officially called the Additional Act to the Constitution of the Empire, this document extensively amended the Napoleonic Constitution to reform the empire into a constitutional monarchy. The act provided for the creation of a new legislative assembly, structured similarly to that established by the Charter of 1814, with an unelected upper chamber, the Chamber of Peers, and an elected lower chamber, the Chamber of Deputies, which was rechristened to the slightly more democratic-sounding Chamber of Representatives. The crucial difference being that the deputies of the lower chamber were to be elected on the basis of universal manhood suffrage. In late April, just before the act was to be promulgated, Joseph Bonaparte, Napoleon's older brother, called on Lafayette to inform him that the emperor wanted to appoint him to the Chamber of Peers. Like he'd done so many times before, Lafayette declined the offer, bluntly informing the elder Bonaparte, quote, "It does not suit me to re-enter political life by peerage or by any other favor of the emperor. I am a man of the people. It is by the choice of the people alone that I must emerge from retirement. If I am elected, I shall join you, as a representative of the nation, to repulse foreign invasion, but I will reserve my independence nonetheless." End quote. Elections for the Chamber of Representatives were held on May 8th. Lafayette put himself forward as a candidate for the district in which Lagrange was located. His positive reputation among his neighbors allowed him to win handily. Georges Lafayette stood for election in the vicinity of Chavagnac and won as well. Overall, the results of the legislative election were not favorable for Napoleon. Self-identified Bonapartists won only 80 of the 629 seats in the Assembly. The overwhelming majority of representatives elected, some 500 of them, belonged to a loose affiliation of Republicans and moderates calling themselves simply the Liberals. The newly elected Chamber of Representatives met for the first time on June 3rd. One of its first acts was to elect Lafayette as its vice president, another unwelcome development for Napoleon. Joseph had left his meeting with the old general a month prior, convinced that Lafayette would be more cooperative with the regime going forward. To this, Napoleon commented, quote, "Everyone in France is reconciled. Lafayette is the only man who is not. He has never yielded an inch. You see him as calm, passive. I tell you he is perfectly ready to start all over again." End quote. Napoleon made an appearance at the chamber on the fourth day of its new session to deliver an address. As vice president of the Assembly, Lafayette was obliged to welcome the head of state on behalf of his fellow representatives. Their conversation was as tense as it was brief. Napoleon noted that it had been 12 years since they had seen each other. He then remarked that he thought Lafayette appeared rejuvenated, that the countryside must have been beneficial to his health. Lafayette could not say the same of Napoleon. Writing sometime later, he stated that what he remembered most vividly from this interaction was how haggard and spent the emperor looked, and how it made him appear far older than his actual age of 46. As for the speech that he gave on that occasion, it was full of overtures to liberty and constitutional rule, but Lafayette judged his words to be hollow. Quote, "You may be pleased with his speech. I was not with his bearing, which seemed to me that of an old despot irritated by the part his position is forcing him to play." End quote. Lafayette's fellow representatives were of a similar mind. Above all, they were concerned about the resumption of war. Coalition forces were amassing on France's borders, poised to invade and depose the usurper Napoleon once more. Writing to a contact who had fled with the king to Ghent, Lafayette postulated that an Allied invasion might actually work to Napoleon's advantage. Quote, "It would turn him into a necessary defender, whereas if they did not invade from the frontier, leaving him to grasp with domestic problems on his own, he might simply collapse." End quote. Lafayette knew that Napoleon's legitimacy had always rested on his military achievements. In this critical moment, he needed a war to secure his tenuous grip on power. With war appearing increasingly imminent by the day, Lafayette lamented the situation, saying, quote, "One feels a great distress knowing that with him gone, we might avoid this catastrophe." End quote. He and his allies in the legislature protested, but it was no use. Less than a week after his appearance at the Assembly, the Emperor led the Army of the North, a force numbering 130,000 strong, to strike against the coalition forces stationed in Belgium before they could commence their invasion. The rest, as they say, was history. On June 18th, the French army was decisively defeated by British and Prussian forces at the Battle of Waterloo. 25,000 of the approximately 72,000 French troops who took the field that day were killed or wounded. The survivors fled in disarray. News of the battle reached Paris on the 20th. Napoleon, half dead from exhaustion, raced back to the capital ahead of the enemy advance. Now, while we know today that the defeat at Waterloo effectively sealed Napoleon's fate, events need not have turned out that way. At the moment, Napoleon still believed it was possible to turn things around. The disintegration of the Army of the North was a severe blow, but there were still thousands more men under arms across the country who might be rallied to resist the Allied invasion. On returning to Paris, Napoleon demanded that the Parliament declare a national emergency and grant him special dictatorial powers until he was able to defeat the invasion. Instead, the Chamber of Representatives immediately turned against him. The next morning, Vice President of the Assembly, Lafayette, addressed the chamber. Quote, "Gentlemen, for the first time in many years, you hear a voice which the old friends of liberty will yet recognize. I rise to address you concerning the dangers to which the country is now exposed. The sinister reports which have been circulated the last 2 days are unhappily confirmed. Now is the time to rally around the old tricolor banner, that of 1789, of liberty, equality, and public order. It is this alone that we have to defend the nation against foreign attacks, and internal dissensions. It is you alone who can secure the independence and the honor of France." End quote. He then put forward a number of proposals, the most important points being to keep the assembly in permanent session until the crisis was resolved, and to regard any attempt to dissolve it as an act of treason. Napoleon was furious at this, grumbling that he should have dissolved the legislature when he still had the chance. He dispatched his younger brother Lucien to get the rowdy deputies back into line. The younger Bonaparte defended his brother's actions, accusing the representatives of disloyalty. Lafayette rebuked him harshly, saying, quote, "By what right does the speaker dare to accuse the nation of having been fickle, of having lacked devotion to Emperor Napoleon? It followed him in the sands of Egypt, in the frozen wastes of Russia, across 100 battlefields, in his defeats and his victories, and it is for having followed him thus that we have to mourn the deaths of 3,000,000 Frenchmen. I see only one man standing between ourselves and peace. We have done enough for him. Our only duty is to save the fatherland." End quote. Later that day, at a meeting of 30 or so high-ranking officials, Lafayette proposed that they demand Napoleon's abdication. Quote, "I ask that we all go to the emperor to tell him that, with everything that has happened, his abdication has become necessary for the salvation of the country." End quote. The Chamber of Representatives issued a declaration to that effect on June 21st. When Napoleon refused, Lafayette proposed issuing the emperor an ultimatum. If he did not voluntarily abdicate, the chamber would depose him. The motion was carried just before midnight. Napoleon was given 1 hour to reply. Napoleon admitted defeat. In the early afternoon of June 22nd, he abdicated the throne. Later that day, Lafayette headed a delegation to thank Napoleon on behalf of the chamber for his cooperation. Of this moment, Lafayette would later recall, quote, "We found him on this occasion, as on so many others, acting outside the ordinary rules of calculation, neither affecting the pathetic dignity of fallen greatness, nor evincing the uncontrollable dejection of thwarted ambition, of hopes crushed, never to revive. We found him calm and serene. He received us with a faint yet gracious smile, and he spoke with firmness and precision." End quote. In the declaration of his abdication, Napoleon stated that he intended for his son, Napoleon II, to assume the throne after him. Seeing as how he was 4 years old and not in the country at the time, the legislature voted to create a provisional government headed by a 5-man executive council that would nominally act on his behalf. Lafayette expected to be appointed to this executive council, but Napoleon's former chief of police, Joseph Fuye, assumed the presidency and moved to prevent Lafayette from being elected. He also appointed Marshal André Massena to lead the National Guard, a decision that left its former commander, Lafayette, feeling quite bitter. Although their exact motives are uncertain, it is clear that Fuye and his allies were determined to exclude Lafayette from holding any real influence in this provisional government. To ensure that he was far away from the capital, they appointed him to a delegation tasked with establishing diplomatic contact with the Allies, an assignment that he reluctantly accepted. The delegation, which included Lafayette's friend Benjamin Constant, left Paris on June 27th. They were convinced that the Allies would be open to negotiating an armistice now that Napoleon had abdicated. As Lafayette assessed the situation, quote, "Had they not solemnly declared that they only took up arms against Bonaparte, that if the nation ceased to recognize him, that we would cease to be their enemies?" End quote. When they reached Allied lines near the town of Haguenau on France's eastern frontier on June 30th, they would be sorely disappointed. Lafayette learned that Tsar Alexander, despite his previously amiable conduct, refused to meet with him or his colleagues, nor would any other Allied head of state for that matter. They were instead directed to meet with a number of lower-level representatives. At this meeting, the commissioners put forward the argument that I just laid out moments ago, that with Napoleon's abdication there was no reason for the war to continue. To this, the British representative informed Lafayette, quote, "I must warn you, sir, that no peace with the Allied powers is possible unless you hand Bonaparte over to us." End quote. Lafayette took offense to this statement, replying, quote, "I am astonished indeed that, in order to propose such an act of cowardice to the French people, you should choose to address yourselves to one of the prisoners of Olmütz." End quote. Lafayette may have had his disagreements with Napoleon, but he did not want him to live out the remainder of his days locked away in a dungeon. After all, he knew too well the treatment that he would receive. Perhaps he still felt a twinge of gratitude towards the emperor for helping him get out of prison all those years ago. In fact, Lafayette was, by that time, actively working to secure passage for Napoleon to America, where he could go into exile. Whether the US government would have granted him asylum is an open question, but the idea might not be as unrealistic as it seems. His older brother Joseph was actually able to reach the United States, eventually settling in New Jersey, where he lived out the rest of his days in relative comfort. In any case, the line of questioning is moot, since Napoleon was captured by the British Navy while attempting to flee France. He was taken to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic Ocean, where he was kept until he died in 1821. To get back to the matter at hand, Lafayette and his fellow commissioners returned to Paris on July 5th, having failed in their mission. By then, the remnants of the French army had begun to withdraw south across the Loire River, effectively abandoning Paris to the enemy. Having witnessed the Allies' intransigence firsthand, Lafayette was in favor of fighting a continued war of national defense, stating that if he were in the government, quote, "I would have pronounced in favor of a battle before capitulation. I would have followed our brave army to the banks of the Loire," end quote. It was not to be. The people actually in charge prepared to surrender the capital. The Chamber of Representatives continued to meet as they waited anxiously for the Allied troops to enter Paris. Neither Lafayette nor his fellow representatives were at all enthusiastic to see the Bourbons reinstalled, which they fully expected the Allies to do as soon as they had the opportunity. Lafayette urged his colleagues to draft a new constitution while they could, saying, quote, "If we are overturned, the people must know what they have lost and what they must regain," end quote. He used almost the same language he did almost 26 years ago, when it appeared then that the forces of counter-revolution might prevail. In 1789, they did not, but this time in 1815, they did. British and Prussian forces entered Paris on July 7th and quickly occupied the city. The next day, when the deputies of the Chamber of Representatives went to reconvene, they found the doors barred and British soldiers preventing their entry. Lafayette proposed that his fellow deputies reconvene at his residence on the Rue d'Anjou. Only once they did, their only action was to unanimously vote to disband, a rather pathetic imitation of the famous tennis court oath. A few days later, King Louis XVIII returned to Paris, roughly 100 days after fleeing the city in March. Thus, the whole episode has come to be known to history as the 100 Days. After vanquishing Napoleon for the second time, the nations of the coalition were determined to prevent something like this from happening again. Keeping France in check was the primary consideration of the new Treaty of Paris that was signed in November 1815. Its terms were a fair bit harsher than those of the treaty of the same name that had been signed in 1814. The kingdom was forced to pay a massive war indemnity of 700 million francs to the various nations of Europe. 150,000 coalition troops would occupy 2/3 of the country for at least 5 years, potentially longer if the debt was not paid in full by that time. A few things did stay from the previous treaty. France's borders were reduced to where they had been prior to 1792, Napoleon II was stripped of his imperial titles, and, of course, the House of Bourbon was again recognized as the legitimate ruling dynasty of the kingdom. When the Bourbons and their supporters returned to France once more in the summer of 1815, they did so in the baggage train of the enemy army, as their detractors said. They shared the Allies' conviction that the nation had to be chastised. A quote spuriously attributed to Talleyrand about the House of Bourbon holds that, after returning to power, they had learned nothing and forgotten nothing. In what is known as the White Terror, sometimes called the Second White Terror to distinguish it from the earlier Thermidorian reaction, Royalists waged a violent counter-revolution against the nation that had so readily turned on them during the 100 Days. Across the country, but especially in the South and West, where Royalist sympathies were stronger, mobs assaulted and in many cases killed anyone deemed to hold treasonous beliefs. This extended beyond only those who had helped Napoleon return to power. Liberals, Republicans, and Jacobins were targeted by these mobs. In some places, even Jews and Protestants were considered fair game for retribution. While this was going on, the government moved to enact vengeance through more legal means. The Charter of 1814 was reinstated, albeit with most civil and political liberties excised from it. Freedom of speech and freedom of the press were suspended indefinitely, meaning that criticism of the king or of the government was effectively banned. Much like during the Reign of Terror carried out by the Jacobins in 1793 and 1794, the White Terror created a pervasive atmosphere of suspicion and fear. Spies and informants were everywhere, prepared to expose traitors to the king wherever they were to be found. Anyone could be arrested and imprisoned without warrant. Military tribunals carried out in secret could convict individuals of treason without definite charges being brought against them. Many were sentenced to long periods of imprisonment or exile. The less fortunate were executed. Meanwhile, the Bourbons sought to rectify their earlier mistakes by carrying out a wholesale purge of the military and the bureaucracy. Thousands of those believed to be politically untrustworthy were forced out of their positions. Some former Bonapartists, like Talleyrand and Fouché, were able to convince the Bourbon regime of their loyalty, whereas some of the more intractable Bonapartists, like Marshal Michel Ney, were executed. Returning the focus to our subject, Lafayette found himself in an awkward position at the time of the White Terror. There was no love lost between himself and the Bourbons. He had been the target of ultra-royalist scorn and resentment since the time of the Estates General. To them, he would always be a Republican, a traitor to his class. More recently, his decision to remain in the country after the king had fled was seen as an act of disloyalty, opening him up to accusations of being a Bonapartist collaborator. That said, the very public role that he had played in compelling the emperor to stand down had not gone unnoticed. He might be a traitor to the king and to his class, but he was by no means a traitor to the nation. So while those in power certainly could not completely forgive him, they also understood that targeting him for persecution could only redound to their detriment. For these reasons, Lafayette was spared from the counter-revolutionary crackdown. W.E. Woodward summarized this dynamic a bit floridly. Quote, "By the jeunesse dorée, the hangers-on and imitators of the Comte d'Artois, Lafayette was despised as a revolutionary and a republican, admired as a man of courage and as a patriot, and feared because of his potent influence. His past was historic, not totally devoid of glory. They were willing to let him have his past so long as he expected nothing of the future." End quote. Interestingly, Fuye and Babeau claimed the reasons that the Bourbons did not go after Lafayette was because he had in his possession a number of documents incriminating Louis XVIII in a plot to depose his brother, Louis XVI, in 1791, which he threatened to have released should any harm befall him or his family. I don't know how true this claim is, but whatever the case, the point is that Lafayette managed to avoid serious repercussions at this time. He did, of course, lose his seat in Parliament when the king dissolved both chambers shortly after his return. All of the men Bonaparte had appointed to the Chamber of Peers were replaced, and new elections were called for the Chamber of Deputies in August. The name reverted back from the Chamber of Representatives after the 100 Days. Under the highly restrictive suffrage laws laid out in the Charter of 1814, and against the backdrop of reactionary mob violence, turnout for this election was understandably quite low. Lafayette was eligible to vote under the charter and did, but prudently decided not to set himself forward as a candidate. Ultra-royalists won an overwhelming majority of seats, 350 of 400, in the Chamber of Deputies. These ultra-royalists in the legislature, who proudly boasted they were more royalists than the king, pursued hardline reactionary policies aimed at undoing the effects of revolution and legitimizing the repression of the White Terror. In this, they increasingly acted against the will of the king, who wanted to pursue a more moderate course, leading him to give the body the epithet of the unobtainable chamber. After the election, Lafayette decided that his foray back into public life was over for the time being, and he left Paris for Lagrange. The estate had been briefly occupied by Prussian soldiers towards the end of the 100 Days campaign. Lafayette lodged a complaint with the Duke of Wellington, commander of the Allied occupation forces, and the Prussians promptly withdrew, leaving the place more or less the way that they'd found it. Lafayette returned there with his family in autumn of 1815, intent on waiting out the storm. And that, I'm afraid, is where we will have to leave off for this week. In the next episode, we will follow Lafayette as he attempts to navigate the oftentimes treacherous politics of the Bourbon Restoration. In the meantime, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to send them my way via my email, perspectivesinhistorypod@gmail.com. Also, feel free to check out the show's website. A link will be in the episode's description. If you like the show and would like to support it, please consider leaving a review on whichever podcast listening platform you prefer, or purchasing some used books from me on eBay. A link will be in the episode description, as usual. Anyway, that should about do it for now. Until 2 weeks from now, this has been the Perspectives in History podcast. Thank you very much for listening. I'm your host, Willem Connor, signing off.
tous la nation l'aura, par le prudent Lafayette, tout trouble s'apaisera. Ah, ça ira, ça ira, ça ira, ça ira, réjouissons-nous, le bon temps viendra.
Ah, ça ira, ça ira, ça ira.
Par les flambeaux de l'auguste assemblée,
ah, ça ira, ça ira, ça ira.
Le peuple armé toujours se gardera, le vrai d'avec le faux l'on connaîtra, le citoyen pour le bien soutiendra.
Ah, ça ira, ça ira, ça ira.
Quand l'aristocrate protestera, le bon citoyen au délirira, sans avoir à le troubler, toujours le plus fort sera. Ah, ça ira, ça ira, ça ira, ça ira, le peuple armé toujours se gardera.
Ah, ça ira, ça ira, ça ira.
Par les flambeaux de l'auguste assemblée,